Hi everyone. This video is going to focus upon the Sakwa book, chapters 9 and 10. The first chapter is the federal state, and it has a question mark with it. And the chapter, as many of the ones in this book, begin with a statement that I think is a question that you need to think about as you read through the chapter. And so ask yourself, the author says, federalism in Russia has always been a contested concept. Why is that? What do we know about the Russian history that means that it's been contested, it's been an issue of controversy? And he does talk about it in the next few chapters there. I want to call your attention to the fact that I think some students in the past have struggled with when we've talked about the concept of the super presidential system that was established by the '93 Constitution. Why wasn't the Yeltsin administration more effective in implementing and taking advantage of that system, as certainly Putin has been since 2000? And how did Yeltsin deal with that? And I want to call your attention to the second to last paragraph on that page, where it talks about where it begins, tax revenues under Yeltsin were allowed in ways that helped to buy off regions that were most likely to succeed. Again, this is federalism we're talking about, and the problem of the regions that wanted to go their own separate way. Um, this, and I mentioned this in passing before, one of the things that characterized the Yeltsin dealing with the regions is that um, he used the tax revenues from oil and natural gas um, to give funds to regions that were likely to succeed, and basically buying off or co-opting those regions and their governors to support or at least tolerate the central administration. All right, and overall, it's in that paragraph ends. Overall, both the federal center and the region suffered from a lack of revenue. We know that during the Yeltsin years, both there was a lack of revenue coming into the state because of the economic disruptions and the low price of oil, essentially, in the 1990s. All right. Then it goes on to talk about the actual structure of the '93 Constitution, the number of subjects that are there, and particularly the next page talks about the current formulation that has 85 entities. This would be the equivalent of 85 states in the United States, 85 federal entities, now including Crimea, uh, and the has three cities that have district as the mayors, were essentially can be called governors too. That's Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the most recent one, Sevastopol in the Crimea. Um, so these cities are treated somewhat independently as separate entities, almost as if, in the United States case, the District of Columbia had state status. Okay? All right. Uh, then I want you to think about why uh, why does the author say that the Russian model of federalism was asymmetric? Now, understand the definition of asymmetric. You should know that. And then think about how that concept would apply to the way the Russians have set up their federalism. And that, I think, would be an interesting question on a test. All right. So then, after this discussion of Yeltsin and the formulation of the Constitution, it goes on to talk about Putin, obviously, and what was the first issue that Putin had to confront? What was the first big issue he had to deal with? I asked a similar question on the last exam about Gorbachev. So think about what was the first one he dealt with here. The third page of the chapter talks about vertical power, and we mentioned that throughout. You should be able to define that term. You should know what it is. You should be able to give an example of vertical power. Then goes on to talk about the 7 federal districts that were created, where the representatives are now authorized representatives of the president, or the Russian word polprad, political representative, POLPRED. That's on 121. You should know what a polprad is. Later, they mention and highlight Silavoki, but you should already know what the Silavoki are. You should also be able to say what was the first assignment that Putin gave to his representatives to these 7 districts. And now the districts are actually 9 uh, because Sevastopol in the Crimea and the Crimea itself were added. So 7 plus the 2 from Crimea, 9 districts. All right. The So what was the first assignment he sent out? Remember, this is an effort on the part of the president to put somebody that has his authority and is close to the president and can get back, tell him what's happening in the region, and that they speak for the president. And this is an effort, again, to control the governors of the various regions. That 121 ends talking again about those bilateral agreements that Yeltsin made and that Putin scrapped with the various regions. Hard to believe, isn't it? Say the President of the United States making separate agreements with parts of the regions. In fact, they were actually called treaties with the various regions. And Putin put that away because that certainly flew in the face of the way Putin saw federalism, and that is the vertical power concept. Think about how Putin was able to push through the vertical power and how he took advantage, for example, of that disastrous massacre at the Beslan school, how he used that to go after the governors. Um, and also the chapter talks about how important the United Russia is to Putin's consolidation of federalism. Because all the politicians, well, I'll tell you a little story that personal story of my family. Um, Apparently, my dad's father was a lifelong Democrat, and after the Civil War, particularly in the North, the Republicans was the dominant party, and so after the Great Depression, when it hit 29 into the 30s, the man that my grandfather worked for went to him and asked him if he would run for office. Now, this is I don't know what his educational level was, but it certainly wasn't high school, my grandfather. And he worked for a contractor in the city, and he said, you are a registered Democrat. There's very few of them. I'd like to put you up for office. My grandfather refused. But this is indicative of when the vast political change, when the politics of Pennsylvania, because of the Depression, went from Republican to Democrat. They were desperately looking for candidates to run. So in the various regions, when it became clear that this new dynamic president was asserting his authority and pushing vertical power, the politicians in all of the regions started changing their registration to United Russia. Now, not all, but vast majority of in the regions, the political class became United Russia in a very short number of years. They saw the writing on the wall. They thought, this is the party of power. This is the party of Putin. We're going to become a part of that party of power. And that helps to consolidate Putin's control. At the bottom of 121, I want you to think about the question, um, why does the author say that the speed with which Putin was able to transform an emerging federal system into a centrally controlled state was shocking? Why would that be shocking? And that you have to think about the past few pages there, and you could come up with a reason that would explain that. He also mentions a concept that social scientists sometimes use, collective action dilemma. Be able to define that. You might find that on a list of questions. Then he goes on talking again about the Federation Council. That's the upper house of the Federal Assembly, sometimes called the Senate. Um, and they talk about the measures that he has put in place to gain control over the Federation Council. Um, then later on that same page, it says there are some alternative explanations that people have offered for this rapid change. So think about what are those reasons that are being put forward. There's at least four reasons in the next two paragraphs that are put forward for how rapidly this change took place. Moving on, there's a concept on 124 that's mentioned several times in the book, the municipal filter. And this is not the way we tend to think of a municipal filtering system in the water system. This is the process by which the established political regime is able to take actions that filter out or prevent opposition candidates from, one, getting registered, and two, if they are registered, not providing them with enough resources that they can effectively campaign, denying them airtime on television, no mention of them in the radio, limited information in the press that might be independent of the regime. So be able to define what a municipal filter is, and this helps to give you some understanding of how Putin can use United Russia and his political allies throughout the system to shore up his power. All right, moving on then, you should be able to explain within system opposition parties, what does that mean? We've talked about that before in the section on political parties, um, and how sometimes these within the system opposition parties. So what are they? You know what they are. Um, they are essentially the parties like the Communist Party and the Liberal Democrats. Okay, so one of the things that it struck me, I wrote it in my notes here when I read this, that as you're reading on 125, the next to the last paragraph begins, in recent years, Putin has made it clear that the popular election and the terms to which they are elected are less important than his personal political will, what Putin wants. And this reminded me of a phrase that goes back, I don't know if you remember this from your courses in Western civilization, but during the First Crusade, what was the slogan that the Crusaders used? God wills it. God wills it that the Crusaders go back and take the Holy Land from the Muslims. Think about that in this context. For the politics in Russia, it is Putin wills it. What Putin wants, what Putin wills will be done. Um, Boy, that's to me that was a pretty powerful remembrance there. All right, on 126, you should be able to understand and express what some of the strategies that the Kremlin has used to bring the mayors and the governors under central control. That should be clear. That's a theme running through this. So remember, what are some of the strategies that the Kremlin, the central administration, uses to control the mayors and regions? The next big section talks about the interaction between the governors and the president. Talks about an organization that we haven't covered called the State Council. And the State Council, even though it was formed back in 2000, has not played a major role, but it is one of these vehicles that Putin has created. He's created the civic chamber or the public chamber, remember, to give the established approved NGOs a vehicle for lobbying and giving input to the regime. The state council is the same way that he has given the governors and representatives of the regions an input into the uh, Kremlin, giving them a way that they can express their views, which is essentially supposedly the function of the Federation Council. But Putin has largely emasculated the power of the Federation Council and then creates this non uh, structural entity. It sits out there separate from the political system as a way to give the region some input into decision making at the center. So understand that and understand how that's different and why it's different from the Federation Council. Um, Okay, and then that section goes on talking about the fact that Putin has established this very elaborate system of evaluating the governors, and it talks about how it's changed. A lot of the detail, I think, is unimportant, but interestingly enough, up on 130, it says one major unlisted indicator of the ability of the governors, to have them evaluated. One of the things that's not in the published criteria for the governors is very important. And it says here, it's the ability to deliver the votes in their region for the national president or for approved Duma candidates. So they have all this very elaborate criteria they can use to evaluate the governors. Are they doing a good job or not? But, but one that's not published that is absolutely critical. Can you bring the bacon home? Can you deliver the votes? All right. And so that section ends that the message is clear to regional officials. Failure to use their control over the regional electoral commission to squeeze out the highest vote for United Russia or for Putin could cost them their jobs. So one of the questions I might ask, what is the best predictor of whether a governor is removed or appointed? And you should be able to answer that question pretty easily. Next section, federal agencies in the regions and the problems of decentralization. It begins with what I think is a question. Ask yourself why the concept of vertical power is misleading. Now, we talk a lot about vertical power, but often if you focus just upon vertical power, you would think that Putin has established a totalitarian regime where orders from the top are transmitted down to the bottom levels and they are carried out um, faithfully following Putin's will. And this book, and I have tried to stress the fact that this is not a perfectly operating system. There's many, many examples in this book and in the readings, in the Myers book, and I think in my lectures, of ways the regime does not work well. So here he's arguing that if you focus just upon vertical power, it's misleading because it implies one channel from the top to the bottom, from the Kremlin to the regions. And he says, in reality, there's multiple channels. So the question is, what are the multiple channels? What are these other ways that politics moves sometimes from maybe not the bottom, but maybe from the middle of the system up to the top? Think about that. And this next section goes on, so you ought to be able to explain that. All these different ways that politics is played out, different levels. And again, this comes back to, I think, the most accepted concept of dealing with Putin as a president is that he is a balancer. He balances all these competing interests, the regions, people close to him, the military. He's always playing one side off against the other, and he's very effective at this. And uh, he has made his position as the central person, the indispensable man, if you will, for the political system. And this is why the question of succession is so critical, because what happens after the great man is gone? And this is why when we are talking about the politics in 2020, we will talk about Putin's latest plan, basically to keep him involved in the political system after 2024, when his current term expires. All right. And the chapter ends. I want you to think about uh, the question as he begins his last chapter. It's difficult to describe Russia today as a federal system, since so many of the elements that constitute federalism have been unconsciously undermined by Putin's Kremlin. So be sure you can identify what elements that we typically associate with federalism have been undermined. That should be pretty clear from reading this chapter, and how that makes the question of a federal system, question mark, which is the title of the chapter, um, so compelling. And then I think the chapter ends on that. The last sentence, I think, is also important. the symbolic significance that protesters have called for federalization of the regions and have been imprisoned as a result because under charges of extremism. So sometimes these protesters that have been out there, particularly going back to the 2011, 2012 protests that I have talked about in my last uh, video lecture, um, put up signs saying a demand of federalism. And this is thought by the regime as an extreme political view because federalism, if can, weaken this power vertical, weaken the central authority. And for Putin, this is a threat, hence the charge of extremism. And you remember when we discussed the section on law, how many of these critical terms that protesters can be arrested under are pretty vague. And, and extremism is one in Russia. And this gets the regime able to turn that on its head and use the charge of extremism to go after dissidents and protesters. All right, now we're going to come to the next section, managing the economy. And admittedly, this is one I will probably go through fairly quickly because I am not an economist. I'm not an expert in operation of the economy, but I am concerned with the political impact of the economy. How does the how does the economy of the country shore up or weaken the regime? All right, and so the chapter 10, managing the economy, begins saying that Russia economic policy in recent years has been dominated by two concerns. You ought to know what they are. It's pretty clear. The deteriorating economic performance and the fallout uh, and the problems with sanctions of the United States and Europe opposing for the regime. It raises here very early in the first chapter, first page, paragraph, the concept of stagnation. Um, and the fact that the economy is slowing down is a concern because this was a problem for the Brezhnev regime, as you remember, we talked about that. So it talks about the recent economic performance. It talks about that in the 26 years of the post-Soviet existence, there's been three crises, one sustained boom, and a general degree of uncertainty. Remember, those crisis years are, it says up at the top, 92 to 99. That was after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the shock therapy years. 08 to 09, and that's because of the world financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis as it spilled over, and then 2014 and 16, and that's as a result of the invasion of Crimea and the involvement in succession in Ukraine and the resulting sanctions on the economy. And the boom years, which really shored up the Putin regime, are 2000 to 2008. Um, and then it talks about how since 2009, while the economy has resumed, the growth rates are subsumed by, or subdued, or less than the growth rates during the boom years. And this is leading to concern that the economy is beginning to stagnate. So it then goes on to talk about what has happened, how the output is falling, um, and interestingly enough, at the end, not that I'm going to ask you this, but any student of international politics should know what is meant by the BRIC, the so-called BRIC countries. And that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they acknowledge here that since 2012, Russia and Brazil have had economic difficulty, while the growth rates continue to go up in India and China. It talks about, then the next section talks about what adjustments can the regime make to try to improve this. Uh, the population being a drag on economic advancement. Um, its real wages have fallen, it says on 137, by almost 8%. Unemployment still remains low in Russia. Now, we don't know what it is in terms of the impact of the coronavirus right now, but the downturn has tended to cut the earnings rather than the number of people employed. And this long-term recession has had a great impact upon particularly the lower income households. increasing the inequality that is already pretty extreme in Russia, just as this current coronavirus is going to increase the inequality in the United States. All right. Um, the On 138, you ought to be able to answer a question: why is the federal budget a key instrument in policy? And there's a section that talks about that. All right. Then there is the next section talks about external finances and the impact of sanctions. That's really pretty straightforward stuff there. On 139, can you tell me what are the two domestic sources of stagnation? And that is the next section talks about that, and that should be pretty clear just to highlight that. Then we move over to 142 and the discussion of the recent economic policy of Russia. And it says Russian leadership has far responded to the deterioration of the economic performance by means of policy rather than reform. And they have to think about that. What are the policies that they have used? And they break it down into monetary and budgetary policy and industrial policy as they try to cope. But why not reform? Why? The effects of the policy change can often be judged fairly well in advance. The reforms have often unintended consequences. So you can predict what would happen in terms if you juggle monetary policy or budget policy or your industrial policy. You can plan that out. But often, um, if you try really structural reforms, what would that mean? That could mean breaking up some of these monopolies that the government has created. Putin uses a term called uh, natural monopolies and national champions to represent like the Gazprom and the Rosneft. Because while they have privatized the economy and they continue to push a capitalist system, they have accepted that there has to be large-scale state control. And these large monopolies that the state has fostered and helped to create, uh, who owns them? Oligarchs, Russian oligarchs that have ties to Putin. And if you're going to start tinkering with Rosneft or Gazprom, this is going to be very disruptive to the political system. And I should have turned my phone off, especially when it's an 800 number, probably asking me for telling me that my car warranty is up. Okay, back to Russian politics. The if you start tinkering with these major national champions that that Putin has helped to create, this is going to impact this group of people around you that are his principal supporters. And later I'm going to devote part of a lecture to talking about Putin's cronies and address the question that Karen Dishwa raises in her book, Kleptocracy, what this means. This is going to be as a result, I think, of the publication in 2016 of these documents taken from a financial services firm in Panama that was published by a German press group, this so-called Panama Papers. The people around Putin have all been benefiting by uh, the closeness to the regime. And what does that mean if you're going to try to create real type of reforms? That's going to be very dangerous and very possibly destabilizing to the regime. Then we come to the last section talking about the future, reform for the sake of faster growth. And there's a separate listing there of reform packages that have been put forward by groups around Putin and at the top levels of the intellectual establishment in Russia. The very first one is one put forward by Alexei Kudrin, who had been the finance minister, who was largely responsible for the National Wealth Fund that was created, the so-called rainy day funds that Russia has built up and held back, that have helped them survive much better than anticipated, these sanctions and the economic downturn since 2014. Then there's one put by a group around economic advisors around the president, the Stolyepin Club. And isn't that interesting? Do you remember who Stolyepin was? The Bolsheviks talked about Stolyepin and his necktie parties that he celebrated because he cracked down in 1904 and 1905. He was the Minister of the Interior under the Tsar. When the country was in revolt, he helped to squelch that revolt and went out into the countryside and rounded up leaders of the Soviets and leaders of the various factions, put them in jail, often executing many of them. And yet, this man is now celebrated as a hero of the Russian state because while he was oppressing the people, he was helping to build a strong Russian state. So you have a group that has chosen his name to symbolize their economic activities and the proposals that they're going to put forward. And it shows how far Russia has come from the Tsarist system to the communist system to this post-Soviet system. And then the third one is supposedly an in-house strategy put out by the regime itself that is very similar to the one presented by the Stolyepin Club, but a little bit more conservative and a little bit less impacting. So, why, again, is it that Putin is more willing to accept an austerity program for the nation itself than to push through reforms that might improve the economic security? And that's a question that's addressed on page 148. All right, and they talk in here a great deal about until you have a legal system that really guarantees property rights, you be very fearful of making structural changes because while we talked about the sectional law and the courts are functioning better, they are still, when it comes to a major issue, under the control of the regime. And so people may think that the courts are operating generally fairly, but if it comes to a major issue, it's the regime interest that the courts are going to have to back up. And so any oligarch, any businessman may fear that to take a reform might lead to the regime cracking down on them. And there's no legal barriers that are going to protect them from this. So think about that. As I said, this long chapter on the economy, all the points I'm interested in on how the economy or the efforts to stabilize the economy, improve the economy, or attempt reform all impact back on the political process, because this is ultimately the course in Russian politics. Okay, so that's the end of that. The next video will come, I'll be doing several lectures on the post-2012 political system. All right, stay safe and have a happy holiday on Easter or Passover or whatever you're celebrating. Just take a break and give yourself a break from watching these videos, because I'm tired of looking at myself in the video. I'm sure many of you are. All right, till next time. Bye now.